Good morning, Chair Bochco and Commissioners. I'm very happy today to have two excellent speakers for you on coastal processes. Dr. Leslie Ewing, our own established and esteemed coastal engineer, and Dr. Patrick Barnard, who is from USGS and has done some incredible research. So I'm not going to do much. I had a longer introduction, but I'm going to just launch into their talks so that we have plenty of time for you to dig into their discussion and then ask questions. Please hold your questions till the end. I think it'll make it move more quickly. So Dr. Ewing, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm going to go through some of the slides quickly, but when we think about California beaches, these are some of the examples that many people think of, these emblematic beaches of Santa Monica Bay and Huntington Beach, and this is their impression of the California coast to many people. But the California coast has a lot of ecology. It's an important ecological region. It's also important economically for Californians and the rest of the country. A lot of that economic benefit comes from tourism, and tourism means people going to our beaches. Overview of the presentation is the introduction. Then I'll be talking about coastal processes. Next will be Dr. Barnard talking about past, present, and future impacts to California beaches. Then I'll talk a little bit about our emergency permits that we've seen recently, finish up with a summary, and then with questions. And these are our emblematic beaches. But we have many, many more beaches, wonderful beaches throughout the state of California. Many of these are wide, broad beaches visited by thousands, if not millions of people every year. And many of these beaches are part of a beach dune complex. There's some urban areas, like in San Francisco, that have built homes and roads and buildings over the dune portion of their beaches. But in other areas, such as Oso Flaco or Lampier Dunes, they have fairly intact beach dune systems. Sand is the connection between the beaches and the dunes. Between these two areas, where the sand goes and builds up the dunes, and then it's on the active part of the beach, when that erodes, then it eats into those dune areas and gets a new supply of sand. And then that sand goes back into the dunes during calmer periods. And it provides for that equilibrium system that gets working back and forth between the dunes and the beach. But dunes are a fairly complex system as well. These arrows are pointing to the active dune face and then to the more ancient dunes that were formed thousands of years ago. Subsequent ice ages and interglacial periods have come along, and dunes have formed in front of them, seaward of those, and that's the more active dune area. And what we see is that when there's erosion into the active dune system, we have a return of that system often many times. But when that erosion gets into the ancient dunes, that's an area that's much harder to restore and return to what had been there previously. And so it's an exchange between the active beach and the dunes, but only a certain part of that is an active exchange. And not all beaches are backed by dunes. There's also a number of beaches in California that are backed by steep bluffs. These tend to have narrow beaches, and when the beaches erode, they erode into the bluffs. The bluffs then provide more beach material, and the beaches widen significantly, and then have the capacity to buffer the waves. Unlike the dune system, however, these narrow bluff-backed beaches do not restore when the bluffs do not restore when the beaches rebuild. The bluff erosion is a one-way system. It's a unidirectional thing where the bluffs erode, but for seismic events or long-term geologic events, those bluffs will not accrete seaward. But not all beaches are bluff and dune systems. Those make up about a third of the California coast, but another third of the coast are pocket beaches. These pocket beaches are narrow, confined beaches, often crescent-shaped beaches, and they tend to function as a small, intact system. They're wonderful systems to get to, often a little difficult, but once you're there, they're worth the effort to get to that spot. And they tend to have most of their transport of sand being onshore, offshore, movement of sand on and offshore, rather than up and down coast, which is a typical thing for more of the linear beaches that we see. When we talk about longshore transport or movement along the coast, pocket beaches may have a transport that's quantified in terms of 1,000 or so cubic yards per year, where for the linear beach systems, it's usually hundreds of thousands of cubic yards per year. So they function under different sort of situations. Now, when we think of beaches, most of us think of sand. And yet many of our beaches are made up of cobble and gravel, if not the whole year, at least for part of the year. And there are also silts and sands that form on our beaches. When I talk about these terms, I'll use both sediment and sand, sometimes interchangeably. But sand is normally, when you talk about in technical terms, it's confined to a small range of grain sizes. And then sediment is a more encompassing term that means the silts, the sands, clays, cobble, gravel, and even up into the boulders. And so sediment is that massive volume of material overall that comes to our beaches. And this brings me to the concepts of littoral cells and sediment or sand budgets. These are two concepts that are developed to understand and explain the changes at specific beach areas. Littoral cells are coastal segments bounded by significant features such as headlands, rivers, submarine canyons, and such that encompass most of the features affecting the sediment in the cell, how it gets there, how it leaves, and how it moves throughout the cell. A sediment budget is more of an accounting system, taking into account all the sediment at the beach areas, what moves in and what moves out. It's often compared to a financial budget, except the commodity is sand rather than money. And we've put copies on your seats of this booklet, pamphlet, on littoral cells. It's a summary of a lot of information, a lot of research that has been done over the years on littoral cells and sediment budgets. If you prefer, you can read it online, and the www code for it is up here, and it's also on the agenda for this hearing item. And it'll be the basis from which I'm speaking when I talk about littoral cells and sand budgets. Now, the California coast has been divided into 27 littoral cells. I mentioned earlier about a third of the California coast will be those long linear beach features. Another third are pocket beaches. That remaining third is mostly the rocky coasts with little or few scattered beaches along them. When we talk about littoral cells and sand transport, we're really talking about the beach systems. And so we don't talk about those rocky areas within the littoral system. They're incredibly important to California. They've got fascinating ecology. They've got amazing dramatic views oftentimes. They make up about a third of the California coast as well, but they're not really part of the sediment cell littoral budget discussion because they lack beaches. The Japanese have a term called nagista. It's used for the coast. It means triple juncture between land, water, and air. Now, the land portion is represented obviously by the sand, the beach areas, and the offshore bathymetry. The water portion of the triple junction is the rivers that bring sediment to the coast and the waves that move sand and sediment onshore, offshore, and alongshore. And then the obvious aspects of the air are the coastal breezes that make the coast so wonderful, or the winds that blow sand into the dunes. But wind is also the source of most of our waves. When the wind blows across the water surface, it imparts energy into the water, turning that into waves. When it's a calm breeze, it's small waves. When it's a major storm, it's going to be large storm waves. Dr. Barnard is going to be talking soon about the oceanographic conditions for the 2015-16 El Nino season and the effect that those waves, those ocean waves generated by wind, had along our coast. Not all beaches are the same, though. This top beach is Monastery Beach. The bottom picture is Carmel Beach. They're only about 4 or 5 miles apart. Carmel is just a little to the north of Monastery, both in Monterey County. And yet they've got very different slopes and grain sizes. Monastery Beach is an area with a very steep beach face. It's just offshore of Monastery Beach is Carmel Canyon. And it means that very highly energetic waves reach this coastline in this beach area. There's a thing called the Monastery Crawl. Anyone who's a scuba diver has gone to this knows it well, where you crawl up the beach face to get out of the swash zone. Yet meanwhile, about 4 miles to the south, Carmel Beach has got a very mild slope. It's got very fine-grained sand, and except during storm conditions, it has fairly low energy waves. This is a hypothetical idea for a sand budget. It talks about the natural sources of sand that come to the coast, rivers, offshore sand supplies, and then erosion of dunes and bluffs. And then some of the natural losses of sand coming from taking away from the littoral cell are to have sand blowing back into dunes, moving offshore, moving up and down coast, going into submarine canyons, things that carry sand offshore. Dunes and offshore areas have arrows going in both directions, both that red going away from the littoral cell and then the green going into it. And it's an indication that both dunes are both a source of sand and a storage area for sand. And then to the far left on this slide, you can see the littoral drift, which is the idea of transport of the sand through the littoral cell. And those arrows should actually be pointing in both directions, but I grabbed the schematic from the brochure you have. And mostly the direction of littoral drift will be based upon the orientation of the waves that are coming into the coast. They set up the current that drives the movement of the sediment, that drives the movement of the water, that carries the sediment. And so most beaches have directional flows going both directions. And then they'll have a net littoral transport that is the cumulative component of both of those transport components. And then these are some of the littoral sand supplies. These river deltas, bluff erosion, and gulling along the coast. These are natural sources for sand getting to the shoreline and being part of the littoral cells. This is an indication of all the river systems that are providing sand to the coast. Rivers provide about 70 to 90% of the sand that reaches the California coast. These arrows are an indication of the volume of sediment carried by the rivers. Predominantly the sands coming to our coast are coming along the north coast, with the Santa Clara River in the central coast is that large arrow in the central California area. There are also a lot of human activities that alter the amount of sand that comes to the coast. We know there are rivers and dams that change the sand coming to the coast. There are many other factors. This shows the change in the river sediments arriving from the coast to the coast because of the reduction from dams. And you can see that in Southern California, about half of the sediment that used to come to the coast has been interrupted because of dams and reservoirs. Dams and reservoirs, of course. We also have detention basins that stop the overland flow of sediment coming to the coast, and there's some inland sand mining activities that remove sand from the active floodplain or from the river system itself. This is removing the sand that would otherwise be getting to the coast to become part of our beaches. Along the coast itself, we have some major structures. Some of the big structures along our coast are actually able to divert some of the sand so that it goes into deep water. The other activities we have are seawalls, so that they stop the bluff retreat, they stop the sand from the bluffs from becoming part of the littoral system. And then harbors themselves can be viewed sometimes as sinks because sand does get into the harbor areas, but most of the California harbors are actively managed. They are dredged to provide for safe navigation, so that sand is only a temporary loss, and then it comes back onto the coast as being placed onto the coast and stays in the littoral cell and then continues to move within the littoral cell. There's sand mining on the beaches, of course. The one activity that we do of beach nourishment is to modify the sand to add sand to our coast. It's the one major activity that is an augmentation of the available sand on the littoral cell. In Santa Monica Bay alone, there has been over 50 million cubic yards of sand added to the beaches since the 1930s. And throughout all of Southern California, there's been about 130 million or so cubic yards of sand added to the coast. Now, 130 million cubic yards of sand is an enormous amount of sand, but it's only making up about 60% of the sand that was lost because of the interruptions to the river system. As vast as that seems, it's only making up part of that. So back to the sediment budget and all that idea. It is a financial accounting. So the amount of sand coming in, if that's more than the amount of sand going out, then you should expect to have accretion. If the amount of sand coming in is less than the amount of sand going out, you should expect to have erosion. That's a pretty obvious system. And often what coastal engineers, coastal scientists will do is try to understand, they understand the trend. They know their beaches are eroding or they know their beaches are accreting. But by doing a sediment budget, you can figure out where things are going. Am I spending too much money on entertainment? Where are these losses coming from? The same way you would do it with your own financial budget, you would do it with a sediment budget. And not all beach changes are based on sediment. Sediment's very important to beaches, but we have seasonal changes. And this is Carmel Beach. Those pictures on the left are winter beaches, where the beach has been stripped down pretty much to the bedrock that's there. And then in the summer, the sand comes back. It's an interannual variation to that beach that happens on a regular basis. We also have concerns about sea level rise. And this is a schematic that was taken from the sea level rise guidance document. With rising sea level, a beach has an equilibrium face that's based on those three characteristics: air, water, and sand, air, water, and land. And so that beach will take on a fairly characteristic profile based on the waves that occur there. With sea level rise, in theory, the beach will just move inland and up. That's what would happen under an equilibrium system. But often we don't have that. We have interruptions to the equilibrium system, and so that equilibrium beach can be truncated by structures, by armoring, that will interfere with the way the beach should behave in that ideal situation. So some of the key aspects of what I've been talking about is that land, water, and air together combine to shape our beaches, and that we do have this idea of a sand budget that helps us understand the changes to a beach. It's not all a mystery. We know that if more sand moves out than it moves in, we're going to have erosion. We're going to have a deficit. If more sand goes in than comes out, we're going to have accretion. And the same is there, we're going to have sort of an equilibrium, neutral change to the shoreline. Some of the changes to the beaches that we see are going to be seasonal. And as you walk along the beach, you know it's different day to day, month to month, year to year. Some of those are seasonal changes, but then we also know there's going to be significant changes to our coast with rising sea level. And those are things we have to anticipate, and using a sediment budget is one way to deal with that. So I will now let Susan introduce Dr. Barnard.
We're very pleased to have Dr. Patrick Barnard with us today. He is a coastal geologist with the U.S. Geological Survey Pacific Coastal and Marine Science Center in Santa Cruz, and he's been there since 2003. He's currently the research director for the Coastal Climate Impacts Program.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to share some of our research findings and directions. And a lot of this work has been inspired by a number of state agencies who look to us for scientific direction in making informed management decisions, particularly the Coastal Commission. And a lot of this work is really improved with the continuous interactions and extensive interactions we've had with people like Leslie Ewing. So coastal hazards, why do we care? Beaches are the first line of defense against coastal storm impacts and impacts from sea level rise. And as seas rise and we have changing wave climates and changing storm patterns, these beach systems are going to be stressed even more than they are today. Globally, over 1 billion people are expected to live in the coastal zone by the end of the 21st century. In California, that translates to roughly 1 million people at risk of flooding just at high tide by the end of this century, in addition to over $100 billion in property in today's dollars. However, we know that these kinds of impacts are most acute during storm winters, especially El Niños, and the impacts from these types of events like 1982-83 and 97-98 can be in the billions. And just a reminder from Leslie's discussion, these beaches support an order of 1 million jobs and contribute about $70 billion to the national economy. So the very fact that we have this body indicates that we are very vulnerable in California. We've built directly in estuaries, directly along the coast, along very narrow beaches, effectively in harm's way, and these are the kinds of areas we see impacts today, not just some far-off thing in the future for our grandchildren to worry about. We've built directly on beaches, and we put roads in harm's way as well. And these are the kinds of things we see on an annual basis during significant winter storms, like here in Santa Cruz. And Southern California is not the only area with these kinds of vulnerabilities. Northern California as well. Areas like Stinson Beach, Humboldt Bay, Crescent City, the list goes on and on. In addition to private infrastructure, there's also lots of critical public infrastructure built literally right at the high tide line. In particular, numerous wastewater treatment plants across the state. And as I mentioned, these effects are amplified during El Nino winters when we have the most significant storms along the California coast. And just as a little bit of a refresher, El Nino Southern Oscillation is the climate variability pattern, which has to do with the distribution of heat along the tropical Pacific. During El Nino winters, like we had in 97-98, and this other very large one in 2015-16, the winds that normally blow this warm water to the west switch directions, and we get very warm water slammed up against the eastern part of the Pacific. And effectively, with all this warm water, it basically is a fuel for more stormy conditions along the west coast of North America. Now, what this means for California is during these El Nino winters, when we have this very warm water along our coast, warmer water is less dense, so it takes up more space, and we have elevated water levels of about 1 foot during El Nino winter, wave energy that can be about 50% above normal, and coastal erosion that can exceed seasonal averages by about 70% and cause flooding and damages that can be in the millions. Now, this last El Nino was largely viewed as a dud from a water resources perspective. In Southern California, we had about 70% less rainfall than a typical El Nino. However, when you look at, this is the Oceanic Nino Index here, this is the metric that NOAA uses to identify El Nino events. 2015-16 was the most powerful event on record. And if you look at some reconstructions of these types of indices, which assess conditions in the tropical Pacific, this event was one of the 3 largest in the last 150 years, along with 82-83 and 97-98. And other indications for this conclusion is that this El Nino winter produced the most active hurricane season in the eastern tropical Pacific. It produced the most powerful hurricane ever recorded in terms of maximum sustained winds in Hurricane Patricia. And winter wave energy equaled or exceeded observed historical maxima across the entire U.S. West Coast. And we detailed this work in a Nature Communications paper which came out earlier this year. So how does this directly affect California? You see we have these fair weather conditions in terms of the atmospheric conditions locally, but we have very significant coastal impacts such as local flooding, extreme beach erosion like here in Goleta, effectively drowning beaches along some parts of our coast with elevated water levels and waves, especially where there's very narrow beaches to begin with, extensive dune erosion across the state, flooding of roadways in some locations, very, very large waves that impacted piers, and also undermined infrastructure such as outfalls. In addition to beach access issues up and down the state of California caused by this excessive scarping. So what was the net result to the California beaches? Well, from those observations, we conclude that it was the most significant beach erosion on record across the state, about 70% more erosion than the average winter. The majority of beaches that we looked at across the state reached historical minimums. That is, the shoreline eroded as far landward as we've ever observed in most cases. But there were instances where the landward retreat was buffered by nourishment, such as some locations in San Diego County. And also, we are fortunate that preceding winters were quite low energy. So we had very mild conditions from about 2010 to 2014. So the beaches had time to accrete quite a bit. So it could have been much worse. However, the drought is actually contributing to the recovery of these beaches, and also the fact that we had a very low precipitation El Nino winter. When it rains, sediment flows through rivers to the coast. That sediment redistributes along the coast, and that's helped supply our beaches. So we have a drought, these rivers aren't running, sand is not being transported to the coast, and so recovery is going to be hindered. This is in addition to this overwhelming and sort of overriding issue of sediment limitations based on dam construction over the last century, which, as Dr. Ewing pointed out, has reduced sediment supply by about 50% in Southern California. Okay, what about trends and projections with El Nino? Well, the most recent research suggests we're going to get more frequent extreme El Nino events like we just felt here in 2015-16, so maybe not more events themselves, but more extreme events that deliver these very large waves. However, there's also this large-scale pattern of a northerly shift in storm tracks over the last 3 El Nino winters, and this is also consistent with a global warming pattern, where with a warming world, we see these storm tracks move poleward. So not only are El Ninos tending to move more to the poleward, in our case along north, but also storm tracks in general. So what this means is we may have more El Ninos like this last one, where we have very powerful waves, because whenever there's these large storms in the Pacific, we get that wave energy, but maybe fewer local storms. So it's likely we could have less sediment input from these El Ninos, which is typically, historically, the silver lining of El Nino winters, that the rivers run and we get lots of sand delivered to the beaches. We may not get that, but we may still get the very large waves. So that's a concern moving forward. Okay, now I'm going to shift a little bit more toward climate change. And I just want to cover a few very basic points given this public audience. And I know in many cases I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think some of these are worth repeating, because often we get lots of questions about, and our colleagues in other states are asked questions like, well, why are we even considering these future projections? I don't think anything's even going on. Why are you even talking to me? So let's just go through a few really basic points about climate change to hopefully nail this down for folks, especially maybe looking from online. So often we hear this argument that there are natural variations in the climate. And so we could be warming or cooling. It's based on much larger scale cycles than just what humans can influence. However, based on these so-called Milankovitch cycles, which you may remember from sort of Geo 101 or Climate Change 101, which is based on the variability in the Earth's orbit around the sun, we should actually be cooling right now. And the other argument is that, well, solar activity fluctuates over decadal time scales. But we are at the lowest solar activity in 65 years. And yet, the last 3 years have been the hottest on record. So easy to discount that one. And some of the more compelling issues are that the rate of carbon dioxide increase in the atmosphere is about 20,000 times faster than any time in the last 500 million years. And in terms of the coast itself, perhaps one of the most concerning observations is that during the last interglacial, about 125,000 years ago, we were just 2 degrees Celsius warmer, but sea level was 8 meters higher, or about 26 feet. So what that tells us, and we are headed easily toward 2 degrees C above pre-industrial, we have about 26 feet of sea level rise baked into the system now. So even if we stopped emitting over the next several decades, it's likely eventually, not in the next century, we will get to these kinds of sea level rise rates. And also, looking at the last just 15,000 years or so ago, there is precedent for extremely rapid rates of sea level rise. During meltwater pulse 1A 14,000 years ago, sea level rose 5 meters per century for 4 centuries, with much, much less temperature change. So that's another thing we need to consider as we make some of these long-term planning decisions, that multi-meter sea level rise over the next century is possible. So what is happening now? Well, based on tide gauges and satellite altimetry, we know that sea level rise rates have increased by at least 50% over the last 20 years. Background rates are roughly about 1.5 millimeters per year, and have since increased on the order of about 3 millimeters per year. But sea level rise is not spatially uniform across the globe, and this is just a map showing the variability in sea level rise rates over the last several decades based on satellite altimetry. And you can see on the far right, very, very high rates of sea level rise in the western tropical Pacific. This is due to ocean circulation and wind patterns, bringing very warm, less dense water to those tropical islands, which is one of the reasons why they are sort of on the front lines of climate change impacts. Conversely, you see along the U.S. West Coast sea level rise suppression over the last 20 years or so. And this is due to prevailing sort of upwelling favorable winds, bringing very cool, dense water to the surface, denser water, less volume. So we've had sea level rise suppression. This is just looking at that same map in a slightly different way, looking at these patterns over the last 20 years or so, just focus on the Pacific basin. So you see we've had very little sea level rise on the U.S. West Coast and a lot in the western tropical Pacific. Now, this is the new pattern based on satellite altimetry. We've seen a very distinct shift in modes. So this sea level rise suppression is over, and now we're having extremely high rates of sea level rise, perhaps above background rates globally now along the U.S. West Coast. So you could, to some extent, the party is over. These impacts are coming now. There is multi-decadal variability sort of inherent in some of these patterns. However, this is something we need to keep an eye on as well. Okay, projections for California. Right now, current state guidance follows the National Research Council, which projects about a meter, about 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of 2100. And it's a very nice study because it includes regional effects, tectonic effects, and other ocean circulation patterns and other local and regional factors that are important specifically to the California coast. Now, there is pending guidance that's being developed at the state level right now, which shows a broadly similar range, a little bit narrower, still looking, sort of toward about a meter or 3 feet of sea level rise potentially by the end of this century. However, now based on recent research on the instability of the Antarctic ice sheets, we're now being asked to look at 3 meters or about 10 feet of sea level rise as a potential upper bound of what's physically possible by the end of the century. So very unlikely. So a very low probability but high consequence event. And it's very likely that the state is going to ask communities to look at this high rate of sea level by the end of the century based on this new research. Okay, but waves also matter for California. We've done quite a bit of research on this along with Scripps, and the global climate models suggest no significant changes in waves along our coast, but perhaps more southerly wave directions, which could be particularly important for Southern California south and west-facing beaches. El Nino, as I mentioned, current literature suggests more frequent extreme events, perhaps accompanied by much drier conditions. But the bottom line is that we have a very narrow band in our extreme total water levels along the California coast. We have very small surges. For example, a massive event in California only produces about 1 foot of surge. Hurricane Katrina produced about 26 feet of surge. We have a very narrow band, so just a little bit more sea level rise, and all of a sudden we're sort of in a new stratosphere where we've never seen water levels before. And that's why today's 100-year coastal water level event in California is going to occur about every 1 to 5 years. And this is going to be felt most acutely in low-lying coastal areas, San Francisco Bay, and a lot of the low-lying communities in San Diego County being among those areas that could be most impacted. Okay, so in lots of consultations with state agencies, we developed the Coastal Storm Modeling System at USGS to project these impacts so you can assess the exposure of your communities and your agency jurisdictions about how these projections will manifest themselves in terms of coastal hazards. So we developed this model to predict the full range of sea level rise and storm combinations along our coast. And a lot of the tools we developed have been in direct collaboration, extensive collaboration with federal, state, and city governments to directly meet their planning and adaptation needs, especially with the Coastal Commission and other state bodies in support of LCP updates and coastal conservancy grants. So Cosmos is coming to a town near you. We've done it for all of Southern California. It's done. For the Bay Area, it's done. So most of the urbanized coast, and we're going to complete these projections across the state over the coming years. The key areas missing now are Central Coast and North Coast, but so far we've covered the majority of the urbanized California coastline. So just a really broad view of how the model works. We take the latest projections from a suite of global climate models, the latest ones developed for IPCC. This in turn drives global and regional wind and wave models, and then we scale this down through a series of nested modeling procedures until you get local hazard projections at a scale of about 6 feet on the ground. So we go from about 100-kilometer scale forcing down to about 6 feet or so on the ground of coastal flood projections. And there's a web tool that's accessible, it's public, very easy to use, developed by our partners at Point Blue. So you can easily go to this site, you can scroll through a number of different scenarios, everything is preloaded. And this is just an example of our area here. We're located in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen today. And you can scroll through scenarios and see kind of where you hit a tipping point of these different combinations of storms and sea level rise, where you're going to have to plan to make key management decisions in the future. Okay, but to some extent, these sort of satellite view maps can be a bit esoteric. You know, what do they actually mean to the policy person, to the regulatory person? And this is just an example from San Francisco Bay, looking at one particular sea level rise scenario. So now we've translated these flooding impacts into socioeconomic impacts. So how many people are affected? How many dollars are affected? And there's a tool we've developed here known as HERA, which translates that flooding information into dollars and people. And so just as an example, for this scenario, we now know for the Bay Area, this could affect on the order of about 350,000 people, $100 billion in property, 2,000 miles of roads, etc. So now we have this information at your fingertips as well. You can dig in at the community scale for your own local jurisdiction, from the city level to the county level to beyond, to identify the dollar risk, the people risk looking forward. Okay. In concert with flooding, coastal change is the other major coastal hazard associated with climate change. In general, rising sea levels are going to drive shorelines further inland, and this is obviously going to increase the physical and economic impacts, which are compounded by this reduction in sediment supply that we've talked about. So we're going to, at some point, we have to make some fundamental decisions, and we have already. You know, are we going to hold the line? Are we going to get out of the way? There will always be beaches if they're allowed to migrate. If we're going to hold the line like we've done here, for example, in Goleta, we're going to lose beaches unless we add lots and lots of sand. So it's either sort of these two end members of we're going to get out of the way, or we're going to hold the line and add lots and lots of sand. And those are some very difficult decisions we're going to have to make in the future. So we developed a shoreline projection model, and I won't go into this in too much detail, but it's called Cosmos Coast. And what's unique about it is that it looks at all the different processes that affect coastal change now and in the future, how sand moves along shore, how it moves across shore, the direct effects of sea level rise, and also sediment supply. And one of the most powerful aspects of the model is that it's completely data-driven. So as coastal scientists and modelers, we often have on the lower three panels these parameters which need to be tuned for each local site, and we often need to guess. We don't have enough local data to know how the beach will respond to wave energy, what the grain size might be. And so what this model does is called data assimilation. It takes all the shoreline data, and on the top is the wave energy, and the middle is the shoreline observations. And every time it hits an observation, it tunes these different knobs so we're getting the right answer historically. Then that gives us much more confidence when we make our future projections. So a data-driven model, it tunes all the parameters locally. Every 100 meters along the California coast, we have these observations and these individual models. So it gives us a lot of confidence in the projections because we're able to recreate the past behavior of the shoreline. So what is the bottom line? And this is some work that was highlighted quite extensively in the press. You may have heard it in various forms. The bottom line is that the projections by 2100 is that many beaches in California will erode on the order of about 50 meters, which is about 165 feet or so. And in and of itself, this is not that big of a deal if these beaches have places to go, but in many cases, they obviously do not. And so on the bottom panel here shows the percent of beaches that will be completely eroded and effectively drowned by 2100, given different sea level rise and management scenarios. So we looked at beach nourishment, we looked at infrastructure, and at the end of the day, historical rates of nourishment didn't make that much of a deal. And by 2100, what this work shows is that about 1/3 to 2/3 of beaches will effectively be drowned or completely eroded by the end of the century if we do absolutely nothing. Okay. Now, just to kind of hammer home this point of coastal squeeze, the issue is not that the beaches are going to erode, it's that they have nowhere to erode to. They're effectively being drowned and pinched against development. And these, where we've drawn the line, like in Carpinteria, for example, in the upper left, I believe the upper right there is Malibu. In some cases, it's to some extent natural. We have these bluff-back beaches. They are not going to erode as fast as the sandy beaches, so the beaches get drowned out. And then we have lots of infrastructure in the way, of course, in terms of, like at the Great Highway in Ocean Beach. Okay, final point I want to just touch on very briefly is that one thing we haven't really talked about in the research community that much is groundwater impacts. And these can perhaps have an equally significant impact along the California coast as well. And this is just a little diagram which shows effective, if you assume that the groundwater table is right along near the surface along our beaches, it's usually about mean high or high water and it slopes inland. These low-lying areas, if you raise sea level rise by 3 feet, that water table is going to raise about 3 feet. And in some cases, it's going to directly inundate these areas. So in addition to inundation, there's issues with shallower coastal groundwater affecting infrastructure, especially foundations, and of course, saltwater intrusion. Now, we don't have a lot of coastal wells in California, so that's probably perhaps not as big of a concern in some areas. In others, I know it very much is, in Humboldt Bay, for example. But I just want to point out here that the groundwater inundation is a topic that we're now exploring and could be equally important. And if you look at this particular example from Huntington Beach, with about 3 feet of sea level rise, in blue is tidal flooding. In green is the areas that would be inundated by groundwater, effectively turning a large portion of Huntington Beach into a swamp before you have significant overland flooding from the ocean itself. So it's a topic that needs to be on our radar as we move forward, and we hope to produce some more quantifiable research in the future to share with you over the coming years. So just to summarize, the beaches and the adjacent communities are highly vulnerable to climate change, especially during these significant El Nino winters. We're going to have an assessment of these impacts across the state within a couple years. We currently have most of the urbanized coastline done, and also lots of web tools at your fingertips to hopefully help you make some of these important and difficult management decisions, and hope to explore more in the very near future groundwater impacts and also changing hurricane patterns which could influence parts of Southern California over the next century. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Very impressive.
And Dr. Ewing will just give you a little quick update on what happened as far as emergency permits in the last El Nino.
Yeah. Commissioners, I'd like to bring this back to some of our work. Dr. Barnard talked about the coastal impacts and the socioeconomic impacts. I want to make clear some of the impacts of El Ninos to our work, that being a lot of the emergency permits that we issue. These are two areas where we issued emergency permits last winter of 15-16, because of the severe erosion that occurred there. This is a plot of the emergency seawall permits that have been issued by the Commission since 1990-91. The bottom years are those winter years. So 90-91 means the winter of 1990 going into the winter of 1990 going into 91. We just finished with the winter of 2016-17. And you can see these peaks and lows in the emergency permits that have been issued. This is a plot of El Nino, La Nina conditions. The upper area is the El Ninos, the strong storm waves, the warm water that Dr. Barnard talked about, those conditions that are likely to become more severe in the future as we go into this new world of conditions that we're seeing. And then the bottom parts of the La Ninas are the mostly calm periods. I've superimposed or overlaid, whatever, plotted these two together so you can see them in comparison. And I've truncated the El Niños so that they match the same time period as the emergency permit data that we have. And you can see fairly good correspondence between El Niños and emergency seawall permits that we've issued. 1997-98 was a major year for issuing permits, unfortunately. It was a major El Nino year and one of the large storm damage years we had. I don't have 1982-83 on here, but that was also a time when there were a number of emergency permits issued by the commissioners for shore protection structures. Sorry, in last year, the winter of 2015-16, we issued 30 emergency permits for seawalls. Some of those, one of those was mentioned today. This past year, we had another 7 emergency permits. That's representation of staff time. We work on these, we pay attention to them and take them into great consideration. It also means that there will be follow-up permits, significant amount of attention in that regard of what the follow-up activities will be. Many of the emergency permits, as you saw in the photographs with public comment, are to place rock, which is viewed as removable. But as we continue to see more emergency needs, more frequent El Niños, there are going to be more and more concerns about erosion. When that rock is placed on the beach, as I talked about with sediment budgets, that means there's less provision of that sand inland to that area to get to the beach. The rock takes up sandy beach area itself. It prevents the creation of new shoreline areas. It stops that equilibrium beach from moving inland. As Dr. Barnard said, this is a condition that is not something of our past, but will be certainly something in our future as well. And will be a significant part of what we think about for the coast going forward. And with that, I'd like to turn the discussion to Mr. Ainsworth. Chant.
I like Dr. Ainsworth. That sounds really good.
Got a promotion.
Don't have to put all that tough time in my PhD. The observation I would just like to make is how this work and Dr. Barnard's work is feeding in directly into our sea level rise vulnerability assessments at our local level that inform sea level rise adaptation planning and our LCP work. So this is critical information that is needed in order for us to plan and adapt for sea level rise. And it's raising some really difficult questions at the local level. You've seen some of those. What is the correct planning horizon we're going to use in the next 50 to 100 years? Where we don't see a large amount of sea level rise in the next 50 years, as Dr. Barnard pointed out. On top with storms, you get almost an equivalent type of impact at 100 years. So we're really trying hard to work with our local government partners to come up with adaptation strategies. The tough part is that we're dealing with billions of dollars of real estate and also development, and we have the local government leaders are listening to their constituents, and they are concerned. They want to take a much more phased approach to sea level rise adaptation planning over time, given there's some uncertainty there, and take small steps. So we are working hard with our local government partners in that respect, and it's difficult. What type of adaptation measures are you then going to implement? Is it going to be retreat? Is it going to be engineering solutions? Are you going to be looking at beach nourishment or other things? And in many cases, it's a combination of all of those factors together that inform what we should be doing going forward. And of course, urban areas are very different than we have up in Northern California, those more rural beaches. So there's in other words, there's no one right, approach. It depends on the context. The other thing is the economic effects of sea level rise. You can imagine along our beaches. The beaches, as I've said to the newspaper, are the economic heart and soul of our beach communities. Imagine a future where we don't have beaches along our coast. That is a frightening scenario and really difficult for our local government partners. So we need a strong vision going forward. I believe in aggressive, we should be aggressively pursuing sea level rise adaptation planning, and we need to be bold going forward. So with that, that concludes my comments, and I don't know if Susan or anyone else. I'll turn it back to the chair.
We just turn it over to questions.
Okay. Thank you. Do we have any questions from the dais? Any commissioners? Commissioner Sundberg first, and then Commissioner Vargas.
Thank you. So I saw there was some communication in the packet from somebody up in my area. Are we going to have any response to that communication? I'm not sure who that question's for.
We will directly work with the person that commented. It was about some removal of vegetation for some restoration of the dunes, I think. And our district staff has been working with that group, but we will follow up with them.
Thank you. Commissioner Vargas? It's a switch. Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation from Dr. Ewing and Dr. Barnard, and then from the comments from Dr. Ainsworth. We have a lot of doctors on deck, which is always a healthy thing. I agree with our executive director, Dr. Ainsworth, that these are impending crises, and that we have to act with. We have to be aggressive in terms of how we approach this. I've been following these conversations ever since I started on Coastal Commission, and there's kind of two items that really make me nervous, particularly because the answers don't always seem to be within our scope, right? When we talk about littoral cells, it seems that a major component, certainly in Southern California, is the amount of sediment that's backed up upstream. From upstream development. It seems that we have identified that as an issue. We know that that's a major component of the reason that beaches in Southern California aren't being replenished. Yet we don't really have too much control of kind of doing something about that issue and kind of seeing how we can kind of manage littoral cells. And just as Dr. Ewing was saying, how we budget our sand replenishment, how we factor that in and come up with long-term strategies on a regional level to handle that. And unless I'm mistaken, I'd love to hear, I hope I'm mistaken, but I don't think there is a single government authority that is kind of charged on handling that. So that would, if there isn't, and I'm correct about that, then I feel like that is one area where we could be aggressive and really be vocal about the need for our leaders in state government to create some type of managing authority to handle that holistically as a littoral cell in general. Dr. Ainsworth, would you mind correcting me or agreeing with me or disagreeing with me?
I'll correct you on the Dr. Ainsworth again in my dreams. Yes, it's all about a collaborative process with many stakeholders and agencies. Some of that collaboration is now occurring through what we call regional collaboratives, like Adapt LA, where we have entities like LA County Flood Control and Public Works involved with those regional collaboratives of how we can get how to get the sediment out of the basins that are upstream. And in LA we have these huge sediment basins capturing large amounts of sediment coming out of the San Gabriel Mountains. And how do you transport that down to the sea? That is one of the difficult questions of how do you do that. And it takes significant investments to fund such an effort. So these questions are being asked and addressed. We have a number of dams being removed up and down the coast. Tom Gibson is working on one up in the North Coast, and has done great work up there. We have Matilaha Dam up in the Ventura area, and Ringe Dam in Malibu. And again, those efforts are moving forward to move that sediment out of there, and it's a difficult technical issue to deal with, to get that sediment down into the system, and a lot of it involves removing these dams incrementally and letting the sediment come through. So I don't know if Tom wants to comment on his great work up in the Klamath River.
Well, I appreciate that. And my second observation, where we have been taking a much more kind of hands-on role and have a little bit more opportunity to tackle the problem, but still could use help maybe from the state level, is in implementing our sea level rise document. I fear that we're now in this stage of having to face the harsh realities of what's coming and make project by project decisions on homes and whether they should be on in vulnerable areas, and it's tough and it's painful and it's personal for those families. But as we heard from Dr. Barnard, that winter is coming, so to speak. So this is coming. It's inevitable, and we need to do stuff. And I fear that we're going to kind of hit kind of a crisis point here, where the courts are going to play a role in deciding whether or not we have the authority to do what's needed to be done, and I hope needed to be done, and I hope we have the full backing of not only the courts but of the legislature and the state government to understand that this is a impending crisis, and we need to manage this appropriately, and we need to have their support and backing. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Schallenberger?
Thank you to both Dr. Ewing and Dr. Barnard. I thought that was both really good presentations and clear to those of us who don't have the depth of background that you do. So thank you very much. It strikes me that there is also another kind of unknown of what it means in the future, which you touched on, and that's the question of where's the mean high tide line. And I'm sure that state lands is grappling with this. It just strikes me logically that if we put up a seawall and armor the coast and therefore obstruct the natural erosion, we are also obstructing what would be the natural mean high tide line. And I mean, I'm sure some of this is going to just be figured out in the courts. But you talked about Sunday, it would be, I think Jack did, about no beaches, in the future, and what that would mean to the economy of those beach communities. But that probably only happens if we manipulate where the mean high tide line would naturally be. And this is going to be public property versus private property conflict, and so I just raised that as an issue that I think we're inclined to want to shy away from, because the forces against us allowing the mean high tide line to move landward are pretty high. But it's an intriguing problem for me.
Well, through the chair, well, it's not an issue we're avoiding. We're hitting it head on. We have a federal grant project coming forward to address how sea level rise will affect public trust lands and also armoring along the shoreline. And our partner in that is the State Lands Commission, and we're moving forward with that effort as we speak. So it is a question of, if not for shoreline armory, that public trust, that mean high tide line would move inland, and that would be state tidelands. So how do you deal with, what's the strategies for mitigation, for example, for a seawall that's placed in those areas where it's appropriate? So it's a difficult question, and it's difficult because it involves, as you say, a lot of complex legal issues. So we're looking forward to this effort, and really the partnership with state lands too. And that partnership is being developed every day now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's like who's taking from whom? Anyway, sorry. I just wanted to mention that it's such impressive research and so vital to what we do, but also anyone who lives on the coast and the cities and counties that are struggling with this. And of course, you know, my biggest fear is that they shut off the money for the research, because this is exactly what we need. This is in the public interest. This is not a political football. This is something that is real, and it's happening quicker than I even thought compared to the research. And I just wanted to say also that I think these graphs are so, you know, where you're showing where the possibilities of inundation are, erosion, accretion. That seemed to me a wonderful tool in our LCP conversations with any given district, that you can show them physically where they may have imminent problems that may actually reduce some of the arguments, perhaps, I'm just saying. But it's good to have, and thank you very much. All right.